What does it take to command a regiment? Whilst we may have vaulted ideas of leadership and particular qualities, on a practical level, not everyone had the expertise or leadership qualities to shine during the Napoleonic Wars. In a world of high turnover of officers due to the attritions of war and a system of purchase in the British Army that saw people jump from regiment to regiment in order to chase the next promotion, how did this seemingly anarchic situation affect the British Army's capacity to fight? Tonight, Steve Brown makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut as we explore the officers of King George's army. We discuss their careers and social backgrounds, the challenges of researching this from half a world away, and how the British Army coped with seemingly unpromising material and heavy attritional loss. This is Fit to Command, the officers of Britain's army. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your quartermaster and friendly part-time host, Liam Telfer. As always, we have the commander of our ship, the wing commander, the cracker of the whip, as I like to call him. I think he enjoys that a little bit with his crime and punishment background. Dr. Zach White in the room. How are you, Zach?
I am well, thank you, mate. How was Unicorn Parade?
Full of you. Well, we've reverted back to Paw Patrol a little bit today. We did have a little interlude into Mermaid Magic. Don't want to advertise too many of these deep and meaningful TV shows. But yeah, we're back on Paw Patrol, which is good. First responders, right?
Absolutely. So this podcast isn't sponsored by Disney Pixar, sadly. If you're wondering what the hell happened and why you've tuned into a Napoleonic podcast to hear about unicorns, you would frankly have to ask Liam's 5-year-old, which is not something that I wish to inflict on you. Delightful though she unquestionably is, like, you don't want to have that conversation about unicorns this early in the morning. Although for our guest, of course, it's not that early in the morning, is it?
Not at all. It is evening. It's dark here.
Today we have an episode which, for those of you that know me, my background is obviously mainly in British Army research. So our guest today is right up my street, as we say. We have Steve Brown. He is a research editor on the Napoleon series website and runs the highly regarded British Regiment and the Men Who Led Them series. Has written some excellent work around the British Army during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. For today's podcast, we're mostly looking at the Fit to Command, British Regiment leadership in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and the latest series, multi-volume series, King George's Army and the Men Who Led Them, 1793 to 1815. And as always, we will put links to all of Steve's work in the show notes. So, how are you, Steve? You ready to kick on?
I'm very good. I have a scotch, so I'm well set.
Well, in the immortal words of Jimmy Buffett, it's 5 o'clock somewhere.
It is indeed, or beyond.
Or beyond, indeed. So, I just want to start off with your latest series. I do have a couple of rabbit hole questions, which I'm sure we'll get to. But your work on King George's Army began with the article in the Napoleon series back in 2009, I believe.
It was indeed, yes. Yes, it was.
Okay. Where did the inspiration for such it's a gargantuan, number of people to be tracking. Where did the inspiration for this series come from?
For a number of years, I was a fan of the Napoleon series website and dipped into it on a quite regular basis. And I really enjoyed Tony Broughton's series on French regiments and the men who led them. And he did the whole gamut of line infantry, Leger, all the cavalry regiments, etc., etc., etc. And that in itself was a massive series. And it got me thinking. I suddenly thought, well, is there a British Army equivalent of this? So I summoned up the courage to send an email to the editor of the general editor of the Napoleon series, who was a guy I didn't know at the time, saying, do you have any intentions to do a similar series for British regiments? And in his inimitable fashion, Bob Burnham sent me an email back, said, yes, are you volunteering? So I sort of thought about it for a bit and said, yeah, look, I'll give it a crack, and I'll have a go and see what I can come up with. So I picked a regiment I didn't know much about, which happened to be the 73rd Foot, and thought I will write something similar to what Tony Broughton had been doing, but for British regiments. And after doing one of them, I thought, have I bit off more than I could chew? Because it's actually a much more difficult task than I thought. Looking at the army lists, I thought it'd be very simple to be able to work out who was in command at any given time, because one only has to look at the army list, but that's great on paper. But in theory, the actual command of a unit on a campaign, or even in the barracks, was an ever-shifting landscape as COs went on King's leave or Commander-in-Chief's leave, or disappeared back to England to sort out their affairs, and leaving the Major in charge, and the Major went on holidays, leaving the Captain in charge. Trying to keep track of who was actually in substantial command at any given time was in fact quite tricky. So it took me a while to sort out the first one, and then I sort of went on from there, but that started in February 2009, but it was very much a Sunday afternoon hobby thing. I churned out a regiment when I had some time on my hands and I was sitting at home and it was raining and there was nothing to do, and I'd pick a regiment and do the next one. So it was very much a kind of hobby project for about 8 years. I actually stopped doing them online in about February 2017, having done maybe 50% of the regiments and some of the ordnance. And then had a bit of an epiphany, and actually it was when I was visiting Bob Burnham in Maui. He said, I think you should turn this into a book. And of course it wasn't a book, it was 5 books. And it's not just a bunch of biographies, it's 4,500 biographies. It's, as you said, it's a substantial body of work. And it's really an encyclopedia in a sense. And I'm hoping it's a very useful reference guide, reference source, because it contains a lot of stuff that comes from kind of first-hand material that you can't really find anywhere else. So that's the history of it. That's how we got to where I am now, and I'm halfway through. I've just started volume 4, so volume 3 should hit the street sometime soon, I hope, through Hellion Books, folks.
I want to dive into the history behind this. I know it's a novel idea that we talk about history on a history podcast, and I want to start with one of the myths, which is all about sort of the social background of officers during this period. We have this perception that they're all sort of Sir Henry Simmersons out of Sharp. They're all aristocrats. They're all largely incompetent. Maybe a few members of landed gentry in there. I guess the first question is that true? And if not, where does the myth originate from for us to have that perception?
Well, like yourself, I blame Bernard Cornwell for this. And every one of these I do, amazingly, Sir Henry Simmerson managed to surface during the session. So I was well prepared for this one. To be honest, I blame the print and the film media, because I think the aristocratic toff upper class twit type is so much easier to caricature than anything else. It's way easier to caricature a Sir Henry Simmerson than it is a hard-working upper middle class kind of officer who's been in the army 15 years and knows his job really well. And in a sense, I almost blame the American movie industry for the movies about the American War of Independence, where invariably the British officers are all upper class twits with wigs. When in fact they weren't. And I did a bit of as part of writing Fit to Command and King George's Army, I've done quite a few deep dives into the backgrounds of the various officers of the various regiments and what their backgrounds actually are. And here's a bit of a question back to you guys. Within the cavalry, which regiments would you reckon had the most peers or baronets or sons thereof between 1793 and 1815 as field officers? Come on, have a guess.
I'm not gonna go with what I think is the obvious one, which clearly would be one of the sort of the household regiments. I'm gonna go with one of the light cav. I don't know, maybe like the 11th or the 18th or something
Ooh,
like that.
you're
I'm
very warm.
absolutely going to be predictable and say surely it's the household
No.
regiments because of their pedigree and their reputation.
The 23rd and the 12th Light Dragoons had the most, with 7 apiece. The 16th Light Dragoons had 6, 20th Light Dragoons had 5, the 7th and 10th Hussars and the 2nd Dragoon Guards had 5 apiece. The 3 regiments of Household Cavalry had no peers. They only had 5 who were sons of peers. So, Liam, you almost get the $64 question there.
I mean, to be fair, that is a massive myth bust, isn't it? Because you look at, I don't know, say the 1970 Waterloo, or popular depictions like Sharp, and everyone would assume, I think, that the household regiments, whether that be those of cavalry or foot guards, they're literally sort of kicking people out the mess to make room for a peer, right?
Well, you would think so, but the statistics tell us otherwise. And if we turn to the infantry, and hang on, I've got to sort of pull up a slide here. Infantry regiments, including foot guards. Well, actually, no. I'll change this question. Which regiment of the infantry do you reckon had the most peers or sons of peers? And you get no prizes for guessing this because it's so damn obvious.
Go on, Zach. Take a stab.
Come
You
on,
go
guys.
first.
Come on.
Grenadier Guards.
Yes. Yes,
What do I win? Do I get a prize?
You get a ticket to you get a golden ticket or something. I don't know.
Okay. Do I want to know what that golden ticket
I don't know.
entitles me
I'm
to?
just making stuff up here. Yes, 7 peers and 8 sons of peers in the period. In fact, more than the other 2 regiments of foot guards combined, and 3 times as many as the nearest line infantry regiment.
Interesting. So straight away, what I'm wondering is our perception skewed by the Grenadier Guards? And so we've sort of transplanted what we kind of feel we know about the Grenadier Guards across the household division as an entirety, if you see what I mean, which is more a sort of theoretical question and more speculative. It's more a comment than a question in that dreaded phrase that people bust out at conferences all the time. But it is a curious one.
Looking at all of the cavalry regiments, and this includes all the way down to household cavalry, all the way down to the 25th, late 29th Light Dragoons, the biggest 50% of their field officers came from the landed proprietors. 17% were sons of former Army or Navy officers, what the Americans call Army brats. 10% were the sons of peers and 5% were peers. So 1 field officer in 20 in the entire cavalry for the period was a peer. It's quite a small percentage. Not included in that percentage is various other categories that I've managed to look at, like there were 3 rankers who became COs in the cavalry regiments. There was a lot of sons of clergymen, popular category. And there were 18 sons of MPs contained in that category. Bearing in mind the cavalry regiments were more expensive to get into, and therefore possibly attracted a more cashed up clientele queuing up to be officers within them. But 50%, a neat 50% exactly, were sons of landed proprietors. And landed proprietors, is the esquire class, which could be anywhere between someone with 5 acres and a couple of £100 income a year to someone who owns a third of a county. So it's quite a big catchment. But that's where the officers came from, which is why earlier on I said, they were sort of hardworking upper class type people. upper middle class, I should say, form the kind of backbone of the officer corps. Peers were like 5%, and that's 5% in the cavalry. It's even less in the infantry. Peers were 4% in the infantry, but 12% in the guards, and mostly in the first guards. But army brats were also a very large category. Army brats were a quarter of the field officer cohort within the foot guards and 22% in the line. So at least 1 in 5 and possibly 1 in 4 officers, field officers, was effectively doing what his father did. And that number actually got bigger after 1815.
With the purchase system, Steve, am I right in saying that there is a price for line infantry, a price for guards, and obviously cavalry is more expensive, and household cavalry is more expensive again. What is it that attracts these peers to light cav? You see that in the infantry, for example, like you say, the first regiment of foot guards is chock full of peers. By comparison, the cavalry, the household cavalry regiments aren't. Where does that disparity come from, do you think?
It was obviously a social thing at the time that cavalry were seemed to be superior to people have to wander around on foot. And I can't help thinking that the hussar uniforms possibly had a little bit to play in that. Possibly that, they looked like dandies. Let's be obvious. Beau Brummel was an officer in the 10th Hussars. Very desirable thing for an officer to do. Look at Lord Cardigan and his cherry bottoms. Admittedly, in a later war, but it was being a cavalry officer was a very glamorous profession, I think, much more so than tramping around on foot with mud spattered grey trousers. So I think that had a lot to do with it. That's my personal opinion. But yes, you're right. Certainly, I think the most expensive purchase of all for a commission was an officer in the household cavalry. I think that was top of the tree in terms of cost, but I don't have a list of figures in front of me.
I mean, I'm curious as to whether or not they sort of reap the rewards of that in time, but perhaps that's a question for either another day or for later in this interview. I'm not too surprised by what you say in terms of the uniform thing, sort of the glamour, the perception, light cavalry, much more dashing, kind of out there on your own, taking it to the enemy, sort of heavy cavalry, having that sort of equivalent of a tank like perception, just sort of head straight at them and smash your way through kind of depiction. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of the heavy cavalry has perhaps a more brutal, clinical, kind of pragmatic, you've got a job to do kind of perception, whereas light cavalry, it sort of feels a bit more sort of dashing and glamorous. So I wonder if that's part of what they're buying into. And of course, if you've got the money to throw at a commission, you want to be able to do the whole thing, right? And also you need to be able to afford the uniform, like fancy gold braid and all the rest of it. Like that comes at a price.
They would have been horrendously expensive uniforms, particularly
completely.
the Hussars. I mean, that would have been like a year's salary back then.
I want to double back to something that you were saying, which was that you said that the proportions changed again after 1815 in relation to that sort of upper middle class pool just kind of growing post 1815. I'm curious as to why you think that might be.
What I did when I wrote Fit to Command is to actually look at how the army changed between 1815 and 1854, 1854 being an obvious kind of line in the sand, being the start of the Crimean War, which certainly from a British perspective was sort of the next major war that came along, at least in Europe. See how much the army had changed. And I don't have the figures in front of me because I didn't necessarily anticipate this question, but I looked at the percentage of, let's call them army brats at Waterloo. And then I looked at the same regiments as existed in 1854 and looked at the backgrounds of those officers. And the number of army brats as field officers was roughly double. there was a great uptake in sons of, the Napoleonic Wellingtonian era officers who obviously, extremely impressed with the glory that their fathers achieved, really wanted to aspire to the same thing, even though, for 39 years or whatever it was, they didn't really do all that much. And, well, I guess some of them probably went off to India and did garrison duty and all that kind of stuff. But there was a big uptick in the number of officers who came from that sort of army brat background. But the other biggest thing I noticed was that between 1850 and 1854, I looked at a couple of regiments, and the percentage of officers who purchased their commission in 1815 in those regiments was below 20%. In 1854, looking at the same regiments, the number of officers who had purchased their commissions was over 80%. So purchase had suddenly, probably with a fairly static peacetime army, promotion is slow. The only way you're going to get anywhere is by purchasing a commission. Purchase became the big thing again, whereas by 1814, 1815, it was just one method by which you could rise up the military tree, at least in the outside the ordnance, within the infantry and cavalry.
So it's obviously quite a complicated system. I think probably more so in that 1813, 14, 15 period for rise, for promotion. How much, if any, is there evidence of promotion being based purely on competency, for being good officers, being good at their job, rather than through purchase? And also, just to tag on to that question, is there disparity between the infantry and cavalry in this regard?
I think the main governing factor in all of this was the fact that, above all else, the British Army was a part of the civil service, and seniority was everything. The War Office produced an army list every year, and I think it's the beginning of the year that shows within each regiment and indeed across the entire army who was senior to whom. After, I think, about 1798, private contractors produced monthly army lists so that officers could check on a monthly basis who was senior to whom and who was inferior or superior or whatever. And I'm very much brought in mind of that scene in the movie Zulu, quite early on in the movie, where Chard and Bromhead are comparing commission dates so they can work out who's in charge. It's very much that kind of thing. And no officer could be compelled to serve under an officer who was inferior to them, inferior in rank, that means. So the army list and the seniority question was massive. It was everything. And a commanding officer of a regiment could not just pick a captain that he liked somewhere down the list and promote him up to major over the heads of others without observing the rules of seniority. And in order to provide, and that problem, if it indeed was a problem, also existed at army level, where you have examples of senior officers arriving in a theatre and being too senior, so they couldn't be employed because they would have to be subordinate to an officer who was inferior to them. So, most notably, there's the case of Lord Moira, who arrived in Flanders in 1794 with a substantial reinforcement for the British Army, but he was too senior for the theatre. He couldn't report to anybody else, so he had to go home again. And I think Wellington grappled with this problem quite a lot in trying to work out who was senior to whom and who could hold division command versus brigade command, etc., and trying to provide workarounds so that he could get the right balance of people that he wanted in the right positions. So it was always a sort of knotty question, and there was a lot of this sort of stuff was always going on. And one of the workarounds that I think that seemed to work quite well was the idea of local rank, so that a major general, let's say, being sent out to Portugal could be locally appointed to be a local lieutenant general, or lieutenant general brackets Portugal, which gave him seniority over all the other major generals and brigadiers. And that sort of thing also existed within the lower hierarchies of command, where it was possible to be a local lieutenant colonel, and in fact, it was also possible to be a local major if they felt the need to sort of bring people up in the tree. The other way of getting deserving people into higher stations was, and this was used quite a lot, was if a commanding officer of an expeditionary force hand-picked an officer to take victory dispatches back home, back to the king or the Prince Regent. Any officer bringing victory dispatches back to the king received an automatic step up in rank. So a major could become instantly a brevet lieutenant colonel just by turning up at the door and handing over the envelope. So these sort of workarounds were used quite a lot in order to sort of balance out and perhaps give more deserving people a chance to step up. That being said, in putting together King George's army, I've come across a huge amount of material of very hardworking but deserving officers who toiled away for years and years and never really got their big chance. And when I was writing some years ago my history of the 45th Foot, called Wellington's Red Jackets, because the 45th was a 2-battalion regiment, when the 1st Battalion arrived back in Ireland late in, I think, about July 1814, and met up with the 2nd Battalion, and they decided to disband the 2nd Battalion, the 10 most senior captains and the 10 most senior lieutenants stayed with the regiment, and the rest were put on half pay. And a great number of the officers put on half pay were those who had actually served in the Peninsula, and those who got to stay on the books were those who sat at home in the 2nd Battalion. So it was very unfair. There's a lot of that went on as well.
I just want to stay with that for a moment. You talk about people being promoted to a local rank. At that point, can they draw the salary of that rank? I know it's a very sort of specific and nerdy question, but I'm just curious whether this becomes a neat way of saving money as well, in that, you promote somebody to local lieutenant colonel, but you only pay them a major's salary. And then because they're just kind of filling the post, it's kind of that thing that you sometimes see in business today. You get somebody to work up to the position,
but you don't pay them for it.
Exactly. And I'm wondering if that happens in order to just reduce the pressure on the pay chest.
I'm sure it did, because of course the British Army was ruled by civilians. It was a tool of Parliament. The king was just there for shop window effectiveness and display. So I am sure that they were not paid at the higher rank, although they had to do the duty at it. A bit like, my wife had the same problem at her school. Having to step up from being leading teacher to being acting principal, but you're still only paid as a teacher. I'm sure that sort of stuff went on as well.
I imagine that not only is it a way to save money, but it's also a way of perhaps sort of placating maybe deserving officers, or take this sort of local rank, and also potentially a way of moving people around in order to either free up space or to potentially get rid of someone who's sort of bugging Wellington or something like that. Or take that local half colonelcy down the road, and there you go, be happy with it.
Yeah, but if you think about it, if you're a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion in the Peninsula, and you're made a local colonel, which means you can potentially command a brigade, it's allowing you to actually command a brigade, and for your superiors to ascertain whether or not you think you've got it in you to be a real brigadier general. It's kind of training wheels, if you like. It's allowing people to show their mettle.
So looking at that, when an officer reached an appointment of battalion command for infantry, regimental for cavalry, and we obviously see that majors do that as well as half colonels, right? How well
captains?
Yeah, indeed. How well are they prepared to take on that leadership responsibility? how much of it was, say, just their personal drive to be good officers, to be good battlefield or campaign commanders, in contrast to formal training, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, prior to 1801, formal training didn't exist as such until Le Marchant created the military college out at High Wycombe, and it sort of went from there. To be perfectly honest, and most officers learnt their job on the job. They really had to go on campaign in order to understand what to do on campaign, or as Wellington said in 1794, what not to do. The Royal Military College didn't really start to produce much in the way of results, even and it only really started in 1801, and other countries had military colleges much earlier than that. And I did a bit of a study that said there was 11,000 officers in the British Army in 1815, of which nearly 1,400 served in the Waterloo campaign, and of that 1,400, 168 were Royal Military College trained officers, or 12%. So still only 1 in 8 as late as Waterloo. And of that 12%, about a quarter of them served in the Foot Guards and the 52nd Light Infantry, and 29 of them served on the staff. And if you look at who those officers were, they were some quite serious people. You got John Fremantle, William Howard Delancey, Alexander Abercrombie, Calhoun Grant, and Henry Harding, Royal Military College graduates. So some fairly senior officers there, but that's as late as 1815. That's 14 years after the college was founded. So it really taking 14 years before the fruits were starting to bear. Before that, officers learned totally on the job, they just simply learnt on campaign, and hopefully they had good mentors and good teachers in having some good battalion commanders to command them. But there was no surety of that. You could still end up with an idiot, unfortunately, sometimes. I also had a look at, and I'm sort of diverting a little bit here, but when I was writing Fit to Command, I looked at a sampling of commanding officers and brigadiers, and I decided to group commanding officers and brigadiers together as a single entity for study, because more often than not, brigadiers were yesterday's lieutenant colonels. They've been promoted to colonel and they get a position on the staff and they're commanding a brigade, so that they're sort of related, because brigadier general back then was not a rank, it was an appointment, and it's usually either lieutenant colonels or colonels were appointed brigadier general for just simply for the duration of the campaign. And in Flanders, in the first batch of regiments that went to Flanders in 1793, the average age of the CO was close to 45, with an average of 26 years in the army, and the average brigadier was 55, which is very old by later standards, with an average of 37 years in the army. And despite all of Henry Bunbury's carrying on about how bad the army was in 1793, in fact, most of the regiments that existed in 1793 were commanded by extremely senior and experienced commanding officers, most of whom had fought in the American War of Independence and some even in the 7 Years' War, commanded by brigadiers who'd been in the army for anywhere from 35 to 40 years. I mean, these weren't infants. These were people who had been around and experienced a lot in the military career. What was not so good at that time was the fact that, and I'm talking 1793 or 94 or earlier at this point, is that any officer could come along and purchase his way from an ensigncy to a lieutenant colonel, as indeed Edward Paget did, in 6 months. So I think roughly on about his 18th birthday, he was given, his father purchased him an ensigncy, and then almost exactly 6 months later, he was lieutenant colonel commanding the 28th Foot, and a couple of weeks after that, he was commanding them in Flanders. And this guy could barely shave. These are the sorts of things that the Duke of York was desperate to stamp out, because how the hell could these guys be prepared to do what their job required? I mean, no way in the world. So those are the examples that Henry Bunbury really took umbrage at, the Duke of York Duke of York introduced a series of reforms in 1795 to put minimum times in service on all of these ranks, so that you couldn't just jump from, lowest grade to battalion command in 6 months, because that was insane. And it provided a more measured approach to promotion. And he also revised it in 1809 to extend those times in service even longer. So from joining the army, you couldn't be a lieutenant colonel theoretically in less than 9 years. So an 18-year-old had to wait till he was 27, if indeed those opportunities came along, or he was able to purchase his way up.
Do we know how widespread that infant officer phenomenon actually was? Do we know how many sort of equivalents of Henry Paget there were during this period? Do you have those kind of figures to hand?
I did look at a couple of examples within Fit Command. I don't have them in front of me, but you do have the ludicrous example of Henry Ellis of the 23rd Welsh Fusiliers, who became an ensign in whatever regiment he started out in at 3 months of age. And I think he was promoted to lieutenant when he was 4 or something. He didn't actually do any service with any regiment till he was about 12, by which time he was already a major.
You shock me. I mean, you can imagine the looks on the faces of everybody when this 12-year-old no doubt rides onto the parade square. I have visions of
His sword was probably taller than he was.
exactly what I'm thinking. The ex-teacher in me is sort of thinking about those kids who pitch up on the first day at school and their parents have bought them a uniform for them to grow into. So it's got about 3 inches additional length on the cuff. And I just have this vision of this guy with a uniform that basically swamps him.
Yeah, and a huge hat.
Yeah, exactly that.
But the flip side to, yes, the Duke of York introduced reforms in 1795 when he was made commander in chief, but before they came in, the Duke of Wellington was able to jump his way up to be lieutenant colonel commanding the 33rd before that date at quite a young age, and that kind of worked out quite well, because, as I said, the average brigadier in Flanders in 1793 was 55. Wellesley, as he was then, was lieutenant colonel when he was lieutenant general when he was 39, 38. So there was a plus side to it.
This is the odd thing, isn't it? Wellington is the example that breaks the rule.
Yeah,
but he's very much no, not very much the exception, but he is absolutely an exception to that wider point.
Mm.
I just wanted to touch on some of that, the sort of stuff on the reforms. And so obviously the Duke of York brings these reforms in to limit how much to make sure that people spend significant enough time in each rank before progressing. I mean, I can't imagine how a 12-year-old, half colonel would be received by some crusty NCOs. But how were those reforms received, or are you able to say how those reforms were received by other officers? Was it generally seen as a good thing, or were people a bit sort of peeved with it?
I'm not actually aware of any opinions about these by serving officers, but I am aware of opinions of officers after the 1809 reforms against officers who have somehow flouted the rules and managed to rise up particularly quickly despite the rules. There was, and I can't recall his name at the moment, but there was an officer who jumped, managed to go from captain to lieutenant colonel in sort of record time in 1810 in the Peninsula, and it caused a great deal of upset within the officer corps. This officer seemed to be just, completely disregarding rules that they'd all had to comply with, but he had flaunted them and just sort of waltzed his way up, largely through connections, because we all know how important connections were back then, to influential people. It seemed to cause a fair bit of disquiet. So I can only assume that the officer corps as a whole, once they'd fallen in line with them, could see the sense of them, because it desperately needed some reform, because the rules before 1795 made no sense at all. In fact, there were no rules, and you ended up with ridiculous situations as we've just spoken about.
So, going back to our planned set of questions, because basically we gave you some questions and then we decided, no, we're just going to rabbit hole. It's the
Gonna
Napoleonic
ramble on.
Wars pod. It's what we do.
Yep.
I think we might have to rename the show the Rabbit Hole Podcast, quite frankly. But anyway, when it comes to battalion and regimental commanders, how much autonomous control do they have over obviously their own units within that wider structure, such as brigade and divisional systems? And I'm very conscious of what you were saying earlier about captains sometimes of necessity being in command just because everybody else is dead and they haven't got a fresh set of reinforcements to bring in more senior officers in. I'm also conscious of the 6 monthly inspection reports that do sometimes pick up on these sort of captain battalion commanders. There's one example that particularly springs to my mind, inevitably, because it's me from a crime and punishment perspective, where the general inspecting is sort of going, no, there's too much flogging going on here, and you sort of get this sense that the captain is trying to prove the point of, no, I am, capable of
I am in
commanding.
command. I'm only 12, but I am commanding. Don't you worry.
So, how much information do we have on that kind of thing? Because there's a lot of speculation that I'm kind of building into that anecdote there. But, do we see these guys potentially wrecking regiments? I'm very conscious of sort of Andrew Bamford's work, kind of pointing to the fact that if you're too heavy handed, you can just destroy a regiment. And that will partly be through a lack of experience in sort of trying to overexert your authority on a situation.
Or underexert. Let's not forget that Wellington had poor old MacDonald effectively dismissed and removed from the peninsula for being too soft on the 57th. Although they said 57th at the time, I actually believe probably needed it, because they're, I think, a bit of a problem regiment by 1814. But yeah, I mean, my understanding of inspection reports, and I've read quite a lot of them, particularly of late, is that when a general officer was doing his 6 monthly inspection report, regardless of who was in command, the commanding officer was judged as a commanding officer, even if they were a captain. The officers acting as first and second major were judged as if they were first and second majors, even if, again, they were captains. So I guess from that point of view, it was fairly unforgiving. But then again, inspection reports got more and more unforgiving as one approached 1815 and the end of the wars. I mean, a lot of the early inspection reports that were done in the 1790s and the early 1800s, I don't think they ever wanted to offend anybody, and they're full of words, full of statements like the regiment marches tolerably well. Statements like that. It's sort of, you can tell they're not super impressed, but they don't want to really upset anybody. Whereas by the time you get to 1812, 1813, 1814, 1815, they don't hold back. This officer needs replacing. It's like they become very much the steel fist in the velvet glove, maybe not even the velvet glove. There was a much greater application of rigor to inspections and what they expected from senior officers, particularly as one got past 1808, and perhaps the realization that this war was in for the long haul. In terms of autonomous control, again, the old seniority question comes up. Who has seniority over whom? And I think as an example, I mean, everybody who's studied in detail what happened at Waterloo is well aware of Colburn's flank attack on the Middle Guard late in the day, with the 1st Battalion, the 52nd, and drawing the 71st, the 95th on the flanks into the attack as well, which was top marks to him. He was top notch. He was probably the best British battalion commander at Waterloo. In fact, possibly even in the Peninsula. But he still had to ask the permission from his brigadier, Colonel Adam, who was quite frankly a novice, and Adam still had to ask Lord Hill for permission to do the attack. So as great an idea as it was, there was still a chain of command that had to be adhered to. And I don't know how long it took to get all those permissions. So hopefully they're all in, I think it was fairly quick, they're all in fairly close proximity to each other. But the chain of command was, and the seniority questions were big issues and things that needed to be adhered to. And particularly with Wellington Command, because he didn't like people doing things on their own. He liked people doing what he told them to. So the autonomous control was kind of regulated, I think, really by the seniority system and the chain of command, and that would apply to virtually anything that occurred between 1793 and 1815.
I mean, I think that's fascinating to look at. The battalion commanders, regardless of rank at this point, but the battalion commanders, it must have been difficult to try and either seize the initiative or, oh my goodness, I've made a mistake here, without then passing that information forward and back. It almost, I mean, I think this period often gets mistaken as being less kinetic than it actually was in terms of battlefield maneuver, right? But in order to advance a battalion, it still takes a lot of time and to get those permissions. I wonder, and I kind of want to look at that within the brigade context as well. I mean, I'm sure that must be the same, right? Adam's brigade, for example, it's a great example. He's still having to ask for permission from divisional commanders. I just sort of wonder how the scope of these battlefields, and using Waterloo as an example, you've got to give some autonomous control, right? Because Wellington can't see everything.
Absolutely, and he doesn't seem to have been involved in this particular transaction, possibly because he was somewhere further along the ridge. But if you look at, say, for example, Leith's march along behind the ridge at Busaco to come to the aid of the 3rd Division, on paper it looks like Leith rocked up in time like the cavalry, came to the 3rd Division's aid, drove the French down the pass. Wasn't it great? But having looked at that particular action in great detail in Fit to Command, there was an absolute stream of aide-de-camps and messengers zipping back and forth between Leith and Picton and Wellington during the 5th Division's march to tell everybody who was doing what, and we please have permission to, please confirm that we're okay to advance. It wasn't just totally off the bat, although Leith was obviously doing the right thing by marching to the sound of the guns. But again, I think that was kind of his mission statement on the night before anyway. If you hear a sector being attached, be prepared to march to it. And he did, and he actually started the march almost in the darkness, pre-dawn, as soon as he heard the cannons. So in all of these actions, there's all of these transactions and permissions and other things going on behind the scenes that don't necessarily make it into the history books, but were necessary in order to fulfill the rules of seniority and fulfill the rules of adhering to the chain of command.
I just want to dig into some of the sort of, I guess, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's a phrase that I quite like, of late, of this system. What are the examples of people who absolutely aced it? We talked about Colburn already as probably the most famous and best example, but also some of the worst. Some people who sort of showed a lot of potential lower down, but then sort of fluffed it and dropped the ball. Thinking of an example higher up that chain of command, there's a lot of discussion to be had about Crawford in terms of whether Crawford sort of is really quite everything that he's cracked up to be, when you look at particularly what happens at the COA, where he sort of seems to have this monumental wobble,
Mm.
and then redeems himself at Basako, famously. So I'm curious whether you've got any examples sort of further down the scale of command, whether there's the material necessarily to shed light on those things. But if you've got the good, the bad, and the ugly, we
Yeah,
want the drama. We love the gossip here on this show.
and indeed you do. When I was writing Fit to Command, I had a bit of an appendix that provided little biographies of 20 office, field officers who I thought were exemplars. And when I submitted it to Rob Griffith at Hellion, he reviewed it and he said, "Well, why don't you? This is a good idea, but why do they all have to be the good ones? Why don't you throw a few duds in there as well? Well, let's chuck in a few that weren't really up to scratch, just for comparison." So I did. Um, and I also tried to shine a bit of a light on officers that have never received much publicity, but were absolute, rock solid, long serving, totally reliable, well liked COs who never really got any kind of kudos for, well, the Peninsula in particularly. So whilst the biographies in the book contain people like Andrew Francis Barnard of the 95th, and some of these names were fairly obvious, the two John Camerons of the 92nd and the 9th, Dennis Pack, obviously, because 5 mention in dispatches and 9 wounds, and more clasps to his Army Gold Cross than anyone except Wellington. What a guy that was. Von Arentschild, commander of the 1st Hussars of the King's German Legion. So there's biographies for those people. Robert Rollo Gillespie, we mustn't forget either, who is a bit of a living legend, but just didn't enter the Wellingtonian universe, but deserves credit. So they're all kind of, there's biographies of those in the book, but within the book I also talk about a few of the not so greats. The prologue of Fit to Command is all about the dissolution of the 85th in 1813, when Henry Kyler, the lieutenant colonel, was forced to retire due to lack of exertion in the face of an extremely fractious officer corps, in which case the Duke of York said, "Oh, you know what? We're going to sack all of them and replace them all." And they did. But there's also other duds like our old friend Sir Nathaniel Levitt Peacock, Baronet, famously retired in quotation marks in March 1814 at Wellington's request for incompetence. And there was actually red flag in my book. There's a bit of a discussion about some red flags that he put up 10 years earlier. So I guess his dismissal doesn't come as a surprise. You've got Welsh Hamilton Bunbury of the Buffs, who resigned in May 1814 before he got sacked for incompetence. We've already mentioned poor old Duncan MacDonald of the 57th, who's retired for being too soft. But there's a wide range of other COs who got let go or cashiered or dismissed for all sorts of weird and wonderful reasons. Like John Elliott of the 1st Dragoon Guards was dismissed for financial improprieties, whatever that meant. Richard Watson of the 7th Hussars was dismissed for disobeying march orders and smoking with the men. God, a shocking thing to do. Robert Honor in Ceylon was cashiered for violent conduct in the mess. Zach, you might recognize the fact that a lot of the officers of the West Indies regiments, spent a lot of the time before court-martials. I'm sure you've probably seen that in your research.
I'm listening to these charges and just going, "Yep, standard, not surprised."
Charles Broughton, who was cashiered for importing necessities for his men and then charging exorbitant prices for the men, for purchasing of them, things they couldn't get from anywhere else.
That's otherwise known as a slow Tuesday in certain regiments, but yeah.
Yes. Richard Wyville, cashiered for tyranny and oppression. George Johnson of the 102nd Foot was cashiered for leading a mutiny in New South Wales. There was a lot of officers let go in this period for various things. Probably more for some of the reasons I've just mentioned than actual incompetence. And I think, although a lot of officers who proven to be not up to the scratch were shuffled aside rather than given the full blaze of glory of their dismissal, they were kind of shuffled off to some cushier post at home where they could not cause any damage. And I know Wellington at one point was very keen to get rid of Robert Byrne of the 36th and another officer whose name escapes me at the moment. He wrote to the Duke of York and said, "Can you please find these guys a position on the staff at home? We need younger guys commanding these battalions." And he did.
Okay, Steve. So as the war goes on, or even in the more attritional campaigns throughout the period, is there any evidence of officer shortages really having an effect on combat effectiveness?
Yes, there are, but officer shortage was not the sole factor that affected combat effectiveness, and I can provide some examples for that. The first one is one where officer shortage probably did have an effect on it, and that was, and we're back to good old John Colborne again with his brigade at Albuera, and he was interim brigade commander at Albuera. And his brigade had 4 battalions, and 3 of them were second battalions, who had been brigaded together for 19 months, and they'd all been in the peninsula for at least 2 years. So they all knew each other very well, I think you'd say by that point. They all knew each other. They'd done lots of brigade exercises together. They'd marched together. But they were chronically short of officers. The second 66th, with Colborne out of the equation, had the senior captain acting as lieutenant colonels, 2 other captains acting as the first and second major, and no other captains left. So all the companies were commanded by subs. The second 48th was only slightly better. The second 31st only had 2 captains left. So most of the captains, again, had subs commanding them. They only had 14 captains for 40 companies. So they were dramatically under-officered. And of course, we all know what happened to Colborne's brigade. It got marched up from the rear in double time in column, started to shake out into line, started to trade volleys with the French, at which point a Polish cavalry brigade suddenly appeared on its left rear, and the first 3 battalions were made mincemeat, basically. Only the furthest away battalion, which was the 31st, managed to form square. And various reasons have been given to why they were ambushed so badly, including, if you read Napier, lots of noise, dark clouds, a sudden rain squall that turned into hail didn't allow them to see them, although Beresford later poo-pooed that and said, actually, they saw the cavalry coming and assumed they were Spanish. And the brigade was basically chopped to pieces. But I can't help but wondering if they had been better supplied with company officers, and bearing in mind these were all second battalions, so they had the most junior officers of their rank, and a lot of them were ensigns. If they had a better complement, or indeed the full complement of company officers, whether they might have been able to save themselves a bit better. They would undoubtedly still have been ambushed, but they might have fared better trying to pull themselves together to form rallying squares, because they pretty much didn't manage to do that, with only one exception. So that's one example of officer shortages having, I think, potentially a major effect. The other flip side to that is the 27th Foot at Waterloo, who famously held the high ground above the crossroads for, 2 or 3 hours in an extremely exposed position, subject to French artillery and swarms of voltigeurs who had managed to get up onto the crest above La Haye Sainte, which they'd captured, and suffered something like 70% casualties. The 27th at Waterloo was not a complete battalion. It was only 6 companies. The other 4 companies were still offshore because their shipping had been delayed, as indeed had most of the staff and officers. So the battalion only had 3 captains at Waterloo. John Hare, who was a brevet major, was acting effectively as the lieutenant colonel, and his other 2 captains were acting as first and second major. So All of the 10 companies were commanded by 10 of the 11th lieutenants, of whom 8 were wounded. The deputy commanders of the 10 companies were the most junior lieutenants, the 5 ensigns, and the 4 most senior sergeants. So they were extremely short of officers, to almost chronic point. And by the end of the battle, the battalion was commanded by a Captain Talbot, who was the 8th in seniority, with only 2 unwounded lieutenants acting as his majors, and all companies commanded by sergeants, of which there were 17 left standing. You might wonder, how the hell did a battalion that was so understaffed with officers manage to stay in position and not take a backward step in 3 hours of being pummeled? And I think the secret was the fact that it was an extremely homogenous unit. 94% of the men were Irish, of whom 2/3 were from Ulster, and mainly from 2 counties, so that they had a common identity. They had common, they all came from towns that were near each other. They all knew each other extremely well. The man for man, the officers that the 27th had were in fact the most experienced cadre on the entire battlefield, as far as the British were concerned. And it was their unit cohesion that held them together. The lack of officers was a problem, but it wasn't an insurmountable problem. It was their strong unit cohesion, which obviously was extremely high, and the fact that they all had such a common background and knew each other so well. And that was the secret of their success. So an officer shortage is a disadvantage, but it's not necessarily terminal if there are other factors in play. And I had a couple of other examples along the same lines, but I think those 2 are probably the best 2.
I think that looking at officer shortages, certainly when I served, there'd never be a senior NCO complaining of a lack of officers, because generally they just get in the way and touch things that they're not supposed to. They're much better off just sat in their mess, having a lovely time and letting us get the work done.
The quartermaster there speaks. Like, do I need to be worried? Are we going to have an example of fragging in the course of this podcast? Do I need to be watching my back, Mr. Telfer? Is that what you're telling me?
No, I'm just. I mean, not only am I sort of alienating more and more listeners, but just look pretty, ride your horse at the front. Don't touch anything.
But that I don't succeed in any of those. This all presupposes that I'm an officer, of course, which is precisely the kind of arrogance that NCOs wouldn't be able to stand. It's a very Waltish perspective.
But can you imagine the 45-year-old, 30-year service sergeant major in an infantry battalion in 1795 being talked to by the 12-year-old?
Indeed. See, I can't even pull out the joke. Well, I look like I'm 12 anymore because I'm getting old. That doesn't work anymore. I do find that point about the Innes killings really interesting, though, not least because we always talk about that anecdote where the guy in command sort of rides up to an adjacent regiment and says, I'm down to sergeants commanding my companies. There's a lot of assumption that they've started with the full complement of officers, and it's only as you've said that I realized, well, actually, that's not quite as huge an attritional loss of officers as is usually assumed. So that's a neat little piece of context.
It's a good point, though. I don't know whether Major Hare rode across to the 4th, who I think the regiment behind them, and saying, "Can we borrow some of your officers?" And the other question I have is, when they were marching from Ostend to Waterloo, presumably the 3 captains had to somehow acquire horses, because otherwise they'd have been walking.
They would indeed. Steve, it's been a fantastic hour and a bit. Thank you so much for your time. Folks, Fit to Command, British Regimental Leadership in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars is available at hellion.co.uk. Go directly to Hellion. Don't make me angry. Don't make me reach for the Jeff Bezos rant now. But you can also get volumes 1 and 2 currently of King George's Army, British Regiments and the Men Who Led Them, 1793 to 1815. And I suspect by the time we release this, that volume 3 will also have hit the shelves. And if it's possible, we'll see if we can get you some kind of juicy, shiny code to incentivize you to go direct to Hellion, because you need to. Steve, thank you so much for your time. I know we've barely scratched the surface on a lot of this, so no doubt we will see you again very soon. But thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you again. Okay.
Folks, this has
Thank you.
been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. Please remember to whack that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on the huge amount of content we're producing as we push out episodes 3 times a week. And if you're loving the show, why not leave a 5-star review? It helps bump us back up the algorithm and reconnect with our lost audience following the Spotify meltdown. Did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and much more besides? To sign up, contact us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get your regular Napoleonic bulletin direct to your inbox. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you could spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who at the time of recording in early October are, in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbel, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically, easy for me to say, named Zed, which isn't just me boosting the numbers before anybody comes at me. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.